thank you very much for attending the first session in the morning. This morning, we're going to be speaking about cyber liability in education. So some of the things that we're going to be speaking today, a little bit about the overall threat landscape. So from cybersecurity, cyber invasions, what was done in the past, what was the focus, what kind of data was interesting, and we'll fast forward that to today and how that threat landscape has changed, how we've gone from kind of a more directed focus in threats to pervasively more widespread threats that really encompasses and ensnares small businesses, individuals, school districts, et cetera. We'll talk about specifically with education, how substantial is our risk and liability? Is that risk footprint substantial? Should we really consider it, or is it the kind of thing there's other markets, there's other organizations that are more at risk than we are? We'll talk specifically about the challenges that you as leaders and educators face every day, and especially as it relates to this changing threat landscape. And then we'll send you home with some homework and a fall reading list. Homework is really about, hey, what can we take back? What can we do now? What should we be thinking about? And the reading list is a list of online resources to help you kind of start that journey for your organization. So the threat landscape, we're going to talk about the changing landscape. So a few years ago, the threat actors were really focused on scoring big data, right? And so the targets were large organizations, whether it's a Target or a Sony or one of the others. They're looking at large caches of data that they're trying to get access to for monetary gain. And it used to be originally a lot of brute force action. It wasn't very educated on the part of the attacker. It was really, we're going to throw as much as we can at it, see if we can break something, get into it, and get out. Now there's this different attack vector, and it's called Advanced Persistent Threats, or APTs. And it's a more sly or cunning way of getting access into an organization, pulling data out, and without being discovered. So it's about how subversive can we be, how can we get in and out of an organization, likely with you never knowing. And it happened with Target, and they didn't know for months. We're going to use them as a great example because their failures and this attack is very similar to what you would experience in your organization, as well as in private organizations. The threat actor, in the case of Target, was well-funded, well-financed, well-educated. So they knew exactly what they wanted to do. In this case, they wanted the millions of records of information of credit cards, right, for the POS system inside Target. So how did they get to it? Well, the first thing that Target did wrong, and this is something that many organizations still face today, is we're exuberant or over-exuberant about sharing internal information. And in this case, Target had a plethora of internal information that was presented publicly, in an instance to be transparent with their business operations, to provide, that feeling of the Target understood what they were doing, they understand their risks, but inadvertently presented a lot of information that was publicly accessible that was used to help initiate the attack. And the attack was made not through Target directly or the POS systems. The POS systems themselves were very locked down. You couldn't get to them directly from the net. There's a series of firewalls and security loops you had to go through. But they had peripheral challenges, and this is something that we all face as organizations, such as our vendor relationships. So in this case, it's an HVAC vendor with a system on their network that used to control industrial controls. That was the weak link, and that was how they initiated access into the network for Target. But that device itself also didn't have access to the POS. So there's this thought process about how we make lateral movement, lateral transitions further and further into an organization's network. So that was the beachhead that they built. And then they continued to probe and move deeper into the network. And they use this with readily available free tools. And these tools are accessible by all of us on the net. And even more importantly, they're accessible and they're known by your students. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So they continue to laterally move into it until they finally hit the POS system. But this movement was not consistent. It wasn't brute force attacks. It wasn't a consistent attack. So it was very hard for the security systems in place at the time to even acknowledge or catch these potential threats, or this threat as it was moving for the network. They would go in, they would attack, and they would retreat and be quiet. And then they would go in a little bit further, attack, retreat, and be quiet. So it was very difficult. There wasn't a direct pattern. And behavioral analytics around cybersecurity at that point was just in its infancy, right? So we've got a couple great solutions now that we can all take advantage of that really weren't available at that time. But the point that they got into the POS system, then it was time about exfiltrating. We're going to exfiltrate, get that data back out. So they compromised another system. They built an FTP server, installed an FTP server on that system, a file transfer server, moved that data over to that device. That device has internet access, and that data all went to Russia. So that's how the process went, and that's how easy it was over time for these educated attackers to get access to what you would have thought was very, very secure data on the part of a large retail organization. So it's a large retail organization, right? It doesn't look like a school district or the organizations that we work in, but the threat, the attack itself is very, very similar. And in many cases, because we don't have the specific inside expertise, the budgets around security, we're at more of a risk than Target was. And that's because even at this happened, so this was almost 3 years ago now, November of 2013. So it's been a couple years, but still a very active methodology to engage and get access to internal resources. But the threat landscape's changed even further now to where we're not just concerned about these large, well-funded threat attacks. We're concerned about smaller organizations and this idea of, I'm not worried about identifying data that's interesting to me, pulling that out for monetary gain. I'm now worried about data that's interesting to you. And I can directly cause you to send me money just to get your data back. So I'm sure at this point you either have been hit with ransomware or you know someone who's been hit with ransomware. This is a very pervasive attack. So now it's changed from, I'm going to focus on a specific target. I'm going to spend months to get in there, get the data out. Now I'm just going to send emails out to everybody I can. And I'm going to hope that I have an undereducated or uneducated staff member that's going to click on a link. And that's all it takes, right? So they're now sending phishing emails directly to all of our staff, right? We're just being broadcast out, and we're clicking accidentally or inadvertently clicking on what looks like a valid email. It's not. And then malware gets implanted in that system. And ransomware is very pervasive in the fact that once it takes hold of a system, it doesn't just focus on that system. It instantly looks for all of the attached network devices. Well, in our organizations, we're attaching more and more devices to our networks than ever before. And every one of those devices are at risk just because of that one beachhead, that one entry point. As we think about what can we do? There's a lot about educating ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about kind of what those takeaways are. How can we better protect ourselves against these new type of threats in this new landscape? But it's also about ensuring that we've got the up-to-date technologies and information to be able to protect ourselves as an organization, and really as an individual, even at home. Right? There's a lot of takeaways, a lot of information, and education that we would provide to our staff members. That's also of high interest and high usefulness for us individually in our private lives. Another big, step back to social engineering. So social engineering in the 1800s was a bank robber walking into a bank, striking up a conversation with the teller, gaining access to preferential information, right? So in the days of computer, ransomware is just this next iteration of social engineering. It's how do I get you to trust me enough to do something I would like you to do? And in this case, click on that link. And the emails are much more insidious than they ever were before, really focused on very specific ideas. I'll give you a great example. A new client that ended up getting hit by ransomware. A controller in the accounting department got what looked like an email from the CEO that said, I'm in a meeting, please wire out $16,000 to this wire. Here's the wire information. And she did it, right? It's just, it looked real. It looked like it came from the person that she would receive something like that or thought she would receive something like that. And that money was gone in an instant, right? And these are the kinds of things, these are the attacks that do the most damage because it's with us and our influx of email and our staff work overload. It's just too easy to miss or to take time to look at and question, is this really a valid email? Is this valid communication that I should be taking action against? Another big issue is the oversharing or accidental disclosure of information. So we'll talk a little bit about some very specific examples around schools and school districts around how data accidentally got disclosed just in the normal process of a staff member doing their job. And the idea that we're over disclosing in some instances as well, where we have maybe vendor relationships and we're sharing maybe some preferential or internal information around student records. And in case of understanding like, okay, well this is the data that they really need, handing over more than they need access to, right? So we're being a little gregarious with releasing or sharing information as opposed to being very, very specific about it. And we'll talk about kind of how we can work around that. Another big issue is industrial systems. So just like with Target, all of the HVAC, those systems are all online. And school districts, we're moving to centralized management of HVAC and a lot of industrial systems that are deployed throughout the schools. And those become target risks. And those are bigger target risks with internal resources, whether it's students or staff in many cases than it is an outside or external attacker. So a couple good examples. Sorry, real quick, another point to the industrial systems. And it's not just, someone gets hold of an HVAC unit, a kid's playing around, they get access to it and they turn it off, right? In Clark County in Nevada had a great example of this where they turned off a school system's HVAC and it got too hot, they had to send the students home. So besides the impact that it had to the school district, to the students themselves, there was a fall-on effect of the economic impact to all of those families, right, that had to take off work and pick up their kids. So when we think about the challenges that we have and the security and the liability we have, it really extends far beyond kind of our borders as an organization into how we impact the students that we care for, the families that they're a part of. And two great examples of an increased insider threat. So we see more and more threats, and school districts are a great example of this. We have kids that are going through school now that never knew not having a computer. I know when I was growing up, my claim to fame was I could fix the clock settings on my VCR, right? And my parents didn't know how to set it, my grandparents didn't know how to set it, I was the guy that they called, right? Well now, who do we call for computer issues? Well, it's my 3-year-old or my 5-year-old, right? I mean, these kids have had electronic devices in their hands really since they were born. And they're very comfortable with its use. They know how to use Google to great effect, right? They know how to get access to data very, very quickly. And that's starting to become a very, very big threat, and school districts are no exception there. So as an example, Tesoro High School in Las Flores, California, students were charged with installing spyware on school computers. They were able to obtain login information and change grades for 12 different students, charged with 69 felonies. But this is, it's pervasive. It's not just I'm hacking into a system. It's I know I can download free or low-cost software, malware software, that I can put on a principal's computer, a staff member's computer, and I can keylog all of the information. So wherever websites they log into or applications they hit, I'm capturing passwords and user information and all that. So it's really pervasive and really easy for someone without a lot of experience and education to be able to get access to those kinds of tools. Another one in Jackson High School in Ohio, they were sentenced to house arrest and community service. They hijacked the district's systems. They changed grade, copied files, pulled out Social Security information from staff members. They anticipated that cost them $500,000 just to rectify the changes and put in additional security in place to ensure it doesn't happen again. So these are monetary challenges that school districts can face, and this is before we consider and we'll talk about this shortly, challenges related to fines, mostly state-based, but even more importantly, jury actions. So, and here's a great example of how easy it is to bypass systems that we as an entity have in place. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with the 86 URL filtering. Either maybe you're using it in the school district or it's in libraries. It's a fairly common, kind of working its way out of the market, but still deployed in many, many places. And this is the filtering solution that minimizes, where a student can access, what they can access on the internet, when they can access it, that kind of thing. And if you notice, if we just type in 86 inside Google, just a couple down, it's how to bypass the 86 content filter guaranteed, right? And it's an easy way to be able to bypass the URL filtering that's been put in place. This data is very prevalent, very easy to access, and especially with someone that knows their way around Google and has lived with their computers all their lives, this is something it doesn't take a lot of time or expertise to do. So let's talk a little bit about how substantial the risk liability is. Data breaches in education cost up to $300 per compromised record. It's really the second sector most globally impacted, healthcare being the first. And we don't realize kind of the costs of it. We're not, fines aren't as prevalent as, say, HIPAA and high tech and kind of the healthcare industry. But jury awards have been creeping up, as well as just the cost that it takes for a school district to be able to rectify the issue, resolve the problem, put those security measures in place kind of post-issue. And the existing law about data security really wraps around FERPA. FERPA is the Family Protection Act, Data Protection Act for students and their families. And it, luckily, all of that personally identifiable information, including health record information, once data, health data is transitioned to the school districts or those authorities, it no longer falls under HIPAA or high-tech compliance. So we're less vigorous about our responsibility or our requirements from a regulatory mandate to secure that data. However, that data is just as important to the student themselves, to the families, and I'll give you a couple good examples of those kind of very specific student health record data breaches and what that means to the families, to the organizations themselves. So while there's a call out in HIPAA that actually carves out school districts where we've transferred that data. It's now student health information instead of HIPAA compliance data. We're shielded from that level of responsibility from a mandate, but not from a moral obligation as it relates to our students and their families. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can protect ourselves and protect their data a little better. And states are moving to this idea of these longitudinal data systems. These are systems that are now tracking the success and the work of our students, of our kids, from the moment they enter school all the way until they graduate. So we're collecting mounds of data, much more data than we ever have in the past, and it's continuing to increase, right, exponentially. So there's a lot more data that we need to be concerned about. And not only just the fact that we have that data, we're holding that data, we're also sharing that data with federal and state institutions and third-party vendor relationships. And we'll talk a little bit about vendor relationships and where the risks are there shortly. Another thing that's interesting, and you kind of see this, is this idea about privacy advocates, individual privacy advocates. And it doesn't matter, and it's not just school districts, it's not just healthcare, but it's these individual organizations that have popped up that are really watchdogs, right? They're trying to shine a light on where inefficiencies and ineffectiveness and breaches happen, and they're really focused on governmental agencies and government institutions, including school systems. And because of this additional insight, it's really easy to find out, well, what's going on in our market right now? Where are these data breaches very prevalent? And they are. They happen all the time. They show up on public websites. They're reported in the news. So there's a lot more focus and notice going to what's going on in school districts and how are we protecting that data and where those inefficiencies are. And it's to the point now that public outcry, and there's an example I'll share with you here shortly, where it's including people that are stepping down and resigning from positions of authority specifically because of these types of breaches. So they're pretty catastrophic when they happen. So here's a couple examples. These are just a few that I've pulled out from a watchdog organization that I'll share with you that you can kind of go in and see much more. But in February 2016, a DC school that accidentally uploaded data to a public Dropbox account. This data included students' age, race, special education requirements, what disabilities and services they're providing, and IEP information. So a lot of very critical confidential information just accidentally uploaded to a public Dropbox. This was a staff member that was just trying to do their job, rushing through something, it gets uploaded, and it's publicly, not just publicly accessible on Dropbox, but publicly searchable inside Google, and that's how it was found initially. In February 2016, the Office of Data and Accountability for Washington, D.C. had another issue where they used an intranet for sharing confidential documents, and that intranet itself was inadvertently publicly accessible. And again, not just publicly accessible, but searchable on Google, to where the content was crawled by Google web bots and search engine web bots. And if you did searches on Google, you would return links directly to confidential data inside their publicly accessible intranet. And these included district documents, personal documents, usernames and passwords to educational resources. So pretty significant data, because we had a challenge where we inadvertently opened up what should have been a secure resource to the public internet. In November of 2015, there was a contractor working with Montgomery School System. They informed the parents about 340 special education records that were stolen during a vendor's laptop. So a vendor had a laptop, their car was broken into, and the laptop stolen. And what was interesting about this is the school district came down on that vendor very, very rapidly. They said specifically, "We're frustrated with their carelessness towards our records." However, the school district came under fire because they didn't even have a policy or enforce education around how we're going to engage with our vendors and what requirements we have for sharing that data with our vendors and what that relationship looks like. So that's an important piece where we're not just concerned now about how do we protect our data ourselves, how do we wrap that around into a nice warm cocoon, but when we're sharing, what are the level of expectations that we're putting upon our vendor relationships? What are the requirements that they have to also ensure the same rigor and enforcement that we have while we're managing our internal data? There was another laptop that was stolen on July 2013 of a school nurse that had a laptop, is in her car, also broken in, and the records were taken. The school district said that they violated protocol because that was stored on that wasn't stored on an encrypted portable drive, and so there's a couple issues there. One is there was a lack of education or consistent training to ensure compliance, and two, and more importantly, there's an idea about using portable drives and really how secure that could be for an organization. So there's a lot about kind of lack of understanding of what technologies are available, how we should protect it, and then ensuring that we've got the vendor relationships in place with that set level of expectations on how to support our security posture internally. In April 2015, Tewksbury Public School Special Education Department accidentally published personally identifiable information, and it's included information on parental cooperativeness. So they rated parents from a 1 to 3 on whether they were cooperative, uncooperative through the IE process for ensuring that their kids were getting the right services. And this was accidentally made public. So it was a pretty egregious example of releasing internal data. And that one, the school committee member, Jane Miller, resigned over that breach. So it's, we're talking about not just changing student lives and staff lives, but our own as well. And on May 5th, 2015, Dixon Unified School District officials had a high school senior that did a very similar thing, put malware, keylogging malware, on a staff machine was able to identify passwords and usernames to log into the grading system, and he made a lot of money changing 200 grades for more than 30 students at the school. So not to scare people, but more to just to understand that the threats are very pervasive, and it's not just our staff. The staff is a great opportunity for protecting ourselves, but the students, the internal threats that exist, as well as our vendor relationships. Real quick on FERPA and HIPAA. So as we mentioned, there's a call out inside HIPAA that if what would be PHI, personal health information or protected health information, once that's transitioned over to the school district, there's a call out that excludes the same vigor around data protection from a HIPAA perspective. There are a couple intersections though with FERPA and HIPAA. And I brought up here the U.S. Department of Education has a joint guidance on the application of FERPA and HIPAA to student health records. And that intersection is around if your organization, if your school district or your school provides healthcare services as part of their nursing or the school program, there's some interaction. But that, luckily, the call out from a regulatory mandate is really about consistent data vendor or transitions, transmittal, and categorization. But again, that call out is not towards the compliance around data security. Now, that brings up a good point, right? So we're not regulatory mandated to have that same rigor around PHI or now student health records that a healthcare organization would. But that really doesn't disclude us from ensuring that we're doing the utmost to protect that very, very critical information for our students and for their families. So what are the challenges that as organizations in school districts and schools, what are the big ones that we're at risk for? And the first one is the reliability of business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response documentation. So most of us by now, we've set up policies and procedures, we've documented those, they've gone through the approval process, and in many cases they're sitting on a desk somewhere or up in a shelf somewhere. We're not actively maintaining the readiness to be able to respond to a business continuity issue, disaster recovery, or an incident response. And we're not flexing our muscles around testing the team, the incident response team that's responsible for responding to an attack, a data loss, an inadvertent sharing of data. And in many cases, we've got people probably in IT that are wearing multiple hats. Those are our incident response teams, but they're overworked. They've got a lot going on, and so we're probably not continuing to build education and ensure that they're sharp and ready to respond effectively. And we're not going out there and running mock incident responses as well to ensure that the team is really ready to go. And then we have InfoSec and cyber defense skill set shortages. So there's just released a very large presentation on the Global Information Security Workforce Study. It was done by ISC2, large security compliance organization. And what they're saying is that we are going to expect a shortfall of 1.5 million security professionals worldwide by 2020. So there's already a challenge finding educated and experienced IT security professionals to be able to even support a lot of our internal processes and procedures. And that is only going to get worse over the next few years. We also have quite an overdependence on IT for compliance and oversight. If someone hears cybersecurity or cyber liability, it's usually our eyes start glazing over and we go, oh, let me go talk to our IT guy. And the reality is IT is really a tool to help provide compliance, to support the initiatives, but the policies themselves, the program management around cybersecurity and cyber liability really exists outside or should exist outside of the IT organization. IT becomes that tool that we wield to ensure compliance, to make sure that the technologies, the tool sets, and the response teams are in place. but we've got to think a little more holistically about program management, or about what security compliance looks like for our organizations. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the takeaways that we can kind of get a jump start on. So we'll jump right into some of the homework. The biggest challenge in education is not unique. This is across the board, all sorts of different markets, public and private. Our biggest security weakness right now across the board is our staff. They're highly worked. They're focused on trying to get a lot done in a very short amount of time. As I mentioned before, they're getting more emails than ever before. They're just trying to get a job done, and we're missing things. We're not educating them. They're either not educated or undereducated on what the risks are and how they could be a bulwark against some of those threats. And this is really our opportunity. It's our opportunity to turn that weakest link, because it really is. So staff is our weakest link from a security perspective, into really our greatest asset. And it's by consistent and reliable education to be able to support, so they understand, what are our risks? What's going on today in the security environment. I'm sure you guys probably, through the news, have just heard in the last couple of weeks, there's a significant phone scam related to the IRS and the Healthcare Act. It's these kinds of things that continual understanding of what's going on currently in the market, what should we be aware of, how do things look, how should I be questioning what I'm receiving. And it's this kind of data and this information that's going to be huge in if we did nothing else, if we kept all of our technologies the same, made no changes from IT, but just started training our staff, we'd be inherently much more secure than we are today. And I'll give you some resources that can kind of help get you down that road a little bit. We're not talking about it's 2-day classes and all this. We're talking about just bite-sized snippets of information on what you should be aware of. What does phishing look like? What questions should I be asking myself? How do I quantify and ensure that this information is accurate and comes from the right person before I act on it? Another thing is administrative and technical control. So just making sure that we're leveraging and using current technologies. And with things like E-Rate and a couple other programs, there's a lot less excuse to have current operating technologies to ensure security compliance. So last generation firewalls, antivirus only solutions are no longer effective inside our organizations. We need to look at next gen firewalls, which aren't doing just, I'm going to look at a packet and decide whether or not that's going to come into our environment. We're actually going to do behavioral analysis against those packets. Why are they coming in? How often? Who from? Is it coming from multiple different locations, requesting the same resources over and over again? So there's behavioral analysis that's now built into it, a lot of kind of artificial intelligence to help us secure and block at the border. From an antivirus solution, antivirus-only solutions are no longer effective in the organization. So we look at true endpoint security models. Organizations like Symantec and Trend Micro and IBM and others have really great multifaceted endpoint security solutions that we can run on all of our desktops, all of our attached devices. And that does the same thing. It'll do behavioral analytics, behavioral analysis, and it helps to secure not just where I'm going and what I'm doing on a machine, but also applications that I'm attached to help identify and stop potential attacks. And encryption, the use of encryption. I mean, before, a while back we go, oh, hey, this is great. We can do whole drive encryption, and it used to take so much processing power that it would kill our systems, right? It wasn't supportable, it wasn't usable, but that's no longer the case. We really should not be running a desktop, especially a mobility device, a laptop or anything, without ensuring that we're encrypting that data, because laptops are a great thing to get stolen. iPads and iPods and phones and all that that theft is rampant. But let's talk about, we've got all these great technologies in place, but how does our IT organization keep track of it? How do they know what's going on? We have all this disparate technologies. We've got firewalls and intrusion protection systems and individual antivirus or endpoint security solutions deployed all across our infrastructure. How can we possibly take advantage or keep keep abreast of what's going on with all those individual systems. And enter SIM, which is a Security Information and Event Management. It's a tool set, software toolkit. There's a lot of different manufacturers out there, Logarithm and Alien Vault and some others that provide this log aggregation. So we point all of those disparate systems, any system that can provide logging. So it could be our workstations, it could be printers, and it could be all of our security devices. And we're going to aggregate all of that data, and we're going to bring it into a collection system. And that collection system is going to run additional behavioral analytics and spit out alerts, right? So we're being able to bring all that noise down to a stream of information that's usable and that our IT organization can get their hands around to be able to understand what's going on in our environment. It's with all the threats that we have, especially those internal threats that we've talked about, we can't say that, oh, I got my firewall, I got all my perimeter security done, I'm protected. We need to understand what's going on in the wire, in the switches, what data is being transferred back and forth with systems in our network, and a SIEM solution provides that level of visibility. Mobility is a challenge for every organization, and education's no exception. I mean, we're starting to hand out Chromebooks or iPads, and we're doing a lot more electronic education in the classroom. So with that widespread advent and the use of mobility, and we probably even have some bring your own device initiatives. We may allow staff to come in and put their email on their phones or their iPads. So protecting that information, that data is highly relevant. And enterprise mobility management solutions are how we get to be able to more easily manage all of these disparate mobility solutions. So whether it's an Android device or an iPad or a Windows 10 laptop, being able to have a single piece of technology that allows us to manage and maintain that environment, identify threats, ensure compliance against service packs and hot fixes and security updates and all that. Giving your IT staff those tools to automate a lot of this would have been a significant amount of manual overhead. A great solution, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but a great solution is VMware has a solution called AirWatch that does all of what I was just saying. So it's not just a single point of contact to manage all of these different mobility devices, but it will implement and enforce your security policies and protocols on those devices. And it will ensure that if they go out of compliance, we can actually securely rip out any of that, the information, the data that's specific to our business, to our operations. And going back to SIEM real quick, or SIM real quick, the big challenge that IT has as an organization is trying to stay abreast of the technologies, to understand, even with the aggregation of the logs and getting the information out, they need to understand, like, what should I respond to and at what level of criticality. And these are where we strongly recommend, some sort of relationship with a security service provider that could provide that insight and that additional support to your staff to ensure that, one, we're not missing things that should be acted upon, and two, and more importantly, we're not acting upon a whole bunch of things that really are more noise than anything else and taking valuable time away from the IT staff's ability to do their job. Policies and procedure maintenance. So I'm sure most organizations with their policy documents and procedure documents, whether it's HR or security or whatever, we go through those periods of revision, right? We take a look at those, we revise them. But if we're not, getting on a schedule to do that same thing with our cybersecurity policies and procedures, our best use and best practices of computer systems and information technology and all that, those should be part of our ongoing maintenance, and usually leveraging an external liability or legal party that could help with those reviews to make sure that with the new things that are coming down the pike, with the new opportunities that we've got for either increased liability because of new awards or lack of legal precedent, which is a great challenge right now. If we see that we're protected from HIPAA as far as those awards and those fees and fines, but we're not protected from jury awards and liabilities around legal action. And the big challenge that we have is we don't have a lot of precedent yet, either publicly or privately, on what those jury awards look like, what's reasonable from based on the breach and the data access. So there's a big unknown. It's really hard for us to quantify at this point. Well, my risk is only $500,000 or $50 million. It's very hard to identify that because we don't have a lot of legal precedent. We also have another issue with cyber liability insurance, where insurance authorities that are underwriting these policies don't have enough track record to really understand their risk. And we're seeing and we're expecting over the next 2 years a 40% increase in current cyber liability policy costs, as well as a shrinking of insurance agencies that are willing to underwrite policies, because this is the threat landscape is so large now. Data is being shared all over the place. We see a lot of legal action, publicly and privately, related to use of personal information, loss of personal information, and they don't know how to quantify that. They're doing their best case based on a short amount of data, but we don't have the longevity yet to really understand what their risk footprint is. So all we can expect right now is at minimum an increasing in policies and maybe a reduction in overall coverage as well, where it used to be in many agencies, many organizations, both public and private, there was a statute of best effort. It was, what is reasonable? What was reasonable for my staff with this level of education doing this type of job? What was their reasonable level of expectation on whether or not this data breach was a liability or a true liability? And that the reasonable standard has really been thrown out of the window in the last couple of years. And there's a level of expectation around knowledge, understanding, written policies, ongoing training to ensure or to provide kind of that legal defense in the case of these kind of breaches or these threats. So business continuity and disaster planning and incident response. This is probably one of the weakest links of many organizations, not just school districts or government agencies, in really flexing our muscles, having a clear-cut plan. If X happens, if this type of breach happens, if this type of data is removed from our organization, if this vendor has this type of issue, what is our response? What's our very specific and actionable response? If this happens, we notify these people. We have this regulatory compliance. FERPA is great about having a requirement model, and the California Civic Code there, that's 1798.29, is specific about what's our obligation as an entity to publicly inform and notify based on these types of data breaches, both electronic and physical. So back up to business continuity and disaster recovery, it's about what do we do, who do we inform, what staff get involved in the response effort, and what are their specific actions that they should take immediately. So what is that hit list of items? So that's the level of disaster recovery and business continuity that we probably haven't put into our response planning. And then it's not just enough to write it, right? We have to exercise those muscles. We need to have those occasional, maybe we do every 6 months or every 12 months, do a review, do those mock runs to make sure that we're keeping our staff abreast of what's going on and they can efficiently and effectively remediate. And a great example of this is ransomware. Ransomware is really time-based. As soon as it gets hit, it's starting to look at all across the network and it's starting to encrypt file systems all over the place. So if we're immediate in our response, we minimize the dramatic effect. And if we have a proper disaster recovery plan in place, we know that even if we have an encrypted set of data, that we can recover 100% of that because we've got that disaster recovery solution in place in the back. And that's a great example is backups are an inherent opportunity to protect ourselves. It's not a matter of are we going to get hit by ransomware or some other threat. It's about what do we do when we know we will get hit. And how quickly can we respond? And the biggest deterrent to data loss in that respect has to do with consistent backup. So are we backing up consistently all of the data that's important to us? Are we restoring it on an ongoing basis to understand that we've got reliable restores? But most importantly, is our backup system off net? Many organizations have been hit with ransomware, and they've gone and encrypted their backup systems as well because they were online, they were on the network. So we need to make sure that that we have the ability to recover our backup and it's stored not directly attached to where the initial incident happened. And then we talked a little bit about cyber liability coverage. There's a challenge on how much cyber liability insurance is required for our organizations. Is it really enough? Are there, and in many cases, there's call outs for what types of threats or a minimum level of expectation of security that's in place as part of the policy plans. And governmental bodies, much as like the state attorney general, have oversight and enforcement responsibilities on local school officers, et cetera, to understand on how to respond to those requests for information and enforcement actions. So there's, besides your cyber liability and the requirements, your minimum level of security requirements called out with those policies, there's also those additional, mostly state. Federal has stayed out so far of a lot of educational requirements. The state is picking up the slack on mandating, how we're going to support our data infrastructure, how we're going to secure it, how we're going to interact with our vendors, and then how we're going to respond and notify in the case of an event. And the last thing I want to talk about is really there's, in this case, in thwarting and maintaining a strong security posture in our organizations, it's really about strength in numbers. It's not about I've got one or two experts in our organization that know how to respond, that know what we should do, that take care of our policies and procedures. It's about educating and understanding from the top down. It's building a series of a staff group that knows what to look for, that can identify issues, that could say, hey, you know what, there's something, Bill in IT, there's something funny going on with this computer. It's giving people the insight and the opportunity to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So real quick, we'll go through just a couple resources I wanted to call out here. The Department of Education has a fantastic resource called the Privacy Technical Assistance Center. This resource is chock full of information on how to build policies, what the notification requirements are for education, what we should be thinking about from security education training for our staff. Great resource. So I highly recommend you take a look at it. One of the center's resources is the data breach response checklist. So we start building that business continuity, that disaster recovery plan. There's a lot of templates and checklists that help us get a jump start on that. So instead of trying to figure it out on our own, taking advantage of some pre-built solutions. The National Conference of State Legislators, ncsl.org, has a bunch of information on security breach notification laws. So who do we need to notify? At what time? And what the ongoing requirements are there. So another a great piece of information. And by the way, I don't have all of the long URLs here. If anybody is interested, after come see me, I'd be glad to share the presentation with the links in it. FEMA has a great solution on business continuity and disaster planning guides. So again, how do we get started? How do I really build a DR plan, a business continuity plan? A lot of templates, a lot of great information from FEMA. FCC has a wizard on how to, kind of a starter kit for cybersecurity and security defense planning. So another great wizard. So again, not kind of zero to hero very, very quickly, taking advantage of the templates that are out there and help build and model around what exists. The employee SATE, onguardonline.gov, is a great tool for how do I start educating my staff? What can I do? What resources can I pull from? Do I have to kind of figure it out on my own and build presentations? There's great videos online, and it's everything from individual commerce, I'm at home buying things online, all the way through ransomware and some of the other more detrimental targeted attacks that we see as an organization. The Office of Inadequate Security at databreaches.net. So this is a watchdog organization. So this is where you could go, log into databreaches.net, go to the search engine, type in education. You are going to see more about education data responses, data loss, inadvertent disclosures than you'll ever want to see. It's scary reading. No, but great opportunity to see what's going on. What I like about databreaches.net, it's a little roughly written, but it pulls information directly from primary reportable resources. So whether it's the Wall Street Journal or known networking entities, not just bloggers, but then they'll put their take on it. This is where the real issue was, right? So yeah, they said that this vendor should have been more responsible with our data, but then they didn't have any vendor relationship plans, right? So it just helps us. It's better to know, right, to understand what's going on, so you don't have to be on that side of the article writing, to be able to learn from those mistakes. And the last thing I want to leave you with, and then I'll be glad to open up for a couple questions. We're at 50 minutes, so we've got a couple minutes for some questions. But uscert.gov, this month happens to be National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Woohoo! All right, I'm sure you're wearing all your badges now. No. But this is a great opportunity to start building awareness, and not just with staff, but also with students, with their families. I would say for this month, take a look at us-cert.gov. Take a look at their National Cybersecurity Awareness. Great resources, a lot of information on how do you get involved, how do we start educating, what kind of information can we present. And then what I'd recommend is that we make this next year, pick a week in October and make it your National Security Awareness Week or National Security Awareness Day. And as we talked about, leveraging not just the staff, but let's leverage our student base as well. I mean, let's help them understand where the liabilities are, where the risks are, how they could help protect the school that they love, the staff that they love. Let them be part of that solution as well. And that's it. That's all I have for the presentation. I really appreciate you guys taking the time. And just real quick, I know we're running late already, but any quick question or two, anything that you'd like answered? Sure. So the first question was, do you have any tips on how do we identify potential ransomware before we open it up or before we click? What should we be thinking about when we see those emails come in? And I've got kind of a great slideshow presentation that has some of that information. I'd be glad to share more of that after. But just a couple quick tips. When it looks like it's coming from a staff member, but asking us to do something that we don't necessarily always get asked, picking up a phone and having a quick conversation with that person's very, very important. The link itself is very important. I can create a link inside, or you can create a link inside an email that says, it looks like it's going to a legitimate resource. But if you hover your mouse over that link and let it sit there for a second, you'll see the actual link being presented. So I could make it look like it's going to us-cert.gov, but if you hover over that link, it's going to somewhere in Russia. So those kinds of things. If the naming doesn't match what that hovered link looks like, that's a great opportunity. Occasional misspellings inside those types of emails are another thing. Another challenge with ransomware that we've seen is organizations that have banking institution relationships. You'll get oh yeah, I bank at Wells Fargo, and they're just saying that they had a compromise, I need to log in now and change my password. These kinds of things. Understanding that organizations like that, banking relationships, they don't send things via email. They're not going to ask you to do something via email. So understanding that as well. But I've got a whole bunch of tips I can give you. And you had said you had a second question? I did. Yeah. So the question, if I can reiterate, was you had a staff member that was on a website that they've gone to, that they use, the mouse hovered over an advertisement on the side and launched a malware attack. So that's a very common alternative way for people to provide or to initiate malware infections, and that's through things like a Google advertising or Bing or whatever. So they do the best they can. They do a really good job, I think, overall of identifying and shutting those things down, but it's not exclusive. And I think a lot of that is where advanced URL filtering from the border, so your firewall, that kind of next generation security solution would assist in some of that. And a lot of that is The other piece, though, the breakdown is a lot less technology and a lot more, to your point, lack of education, right? If she got a pop-up that says, you've been ransomed, what's the first thing she should have done, right? She should call somebody, right? Oh my gosh, I don't know what happened. Hey, can you take a look at this? I mean, that's what will help minimize that risk. So it's already been deployed. It's starting the infection, but if we can at least notify our IT staff so they could respond quickly, we'll minimize, that potential data loss. All right. Yes, ma'am. Right. No, that's a great question. So the question was really, how do we educate our staff, but not to the point that they become paranoid? How do we balance that opportunity? And I think, the education, our staff, I think as a whole, I mean, they're bought into the mission of the organization, right? They're here for a reason, right? To do their job. And I think what we found more often is we start educating people. It's about, yes, I want that information. I just want to know. I want to know because I want to be more effective instead of questioning more often. And what we find is exactly the opposite. The more we've educated, the less we've got people that are paralyzed about doing anything. And it's all about the delivery too. It's not about, oh my gosh, look at this huge disaster, make sure you don't do this. It's about, hey, here's things that you need to think about. Like, here's a great example of the type of malware or type of ransomware that's going on. These are the couple things that you should keep in the back of your mind. We don't want to inundate them with so much data that they shut down, for sure. But just give them the sliver of details that they need just to help make educated guesses. And what we found is that because you give them that information, they're more efficient and more effective. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the time up here.